Welcome to the J3U University podcast. I'm your host, John Jewett.
And I'm your co-host, Luke Miller.
Our mission is to elevate the physique coaching standard
and deliver the highest level of competitors to the stage.
Let's jump into today's episode. Growing between shows. Harnessing this anabolic rebound post-show and growing, is this the opportune time to actually add slabs of muscle on before your next show? Or should it just be the recovery side and actually the worst time to add muscle on? Partially debate. We have different crowds saying different things. If you listen to our podcast, you've heard some of our opinions around this as well. But there's always exceptions, especially in the coaching world. There's rarely situations where you're saying always and never. So we're going to talk about growing into the show today. How's it going, Luke?
Good, man. I think the answer for this is both. Like I think this is like the one situation in our realm where you could make arguments both directions. And I'm really kind of excited to get into like some of the reasons why and why not, because like, if you were just to ask me in the elevator pitch of like the 15-second, what's your go? I'd say post-show is primarily your time to recover. It's not your time to grow. But the caveat is with extremely well-managed processes, that time to recover is massively shortened, and we can leverage really low body composition into a really productive long all-season growth phase. And so kind of I'll just like start that off there and then let you kind of kick off some more initial thoughts, because that's where I'm sitting right now with the whole conversation.
Well, I was going to frame this around between shows, because we could hit post-show as well, but into an off season, but
I classify between shows as post show, right? Because even though
it's
a time frame between shows, I'm assuming we're like kind of taking the fact that they show up to the first show all the way in contest shape, right?
Well, I think that's the situations to tease out, right?
Yeah.
So I think with why I even bring up for the listeners why we would separate these is because if you had an off season ahead, then I would do things different in the post-show to set you up for what is about to be, for an enhanced athlete, a long duration of PED exposure, rather than like throwing it all in right off the bat. Now, if you grow and happen to be off like optimized variables and low PEDs and recovering health, great. It's very well possible. But the situations that I want to like really dive into are the ones where you had these between show periods. And I think there's so many people that say over there like, oh man, I got off stage. The judges said I need to have fuller delts. I'm going to start training delts 4 days a week. I'm going to grow these delts into this next show that's 4 weeks away and see those improvements. Or they said they're fuller and they just were like, I just need to eat more Pop-Tarts or something. But
yeah.
But anyway, why this just starts? Why is it again a challenge post-show to grow? Because you typically are not in the best position, like an off season. We have the best variables possible recovery-wise to grow, and what you really need all this recovery for is to take that stimulus from training. The adaptations occur, and then they are expressed in tissue accrual, strength gain changes. But with this recovery variable moving way down, you can only put so much stimulus in and actually recover from it. So these adaptations end up not being displayed in actual growth. It's more might be even muscle maintenance, or look at the extreme of a natural competitor that you can train and train and train. You might actually lead to muscle loss because you're just training beyond even your recovery capacity. And so this is why that recovery bank is dropping down. But why is that recovery bank dropping down? It's like all the chronic adaptations that you're seeing in a contest prep. Now with an enhanced athlete, we are putting in a lot of the hormones. So you're like, well, I have hormones there. And yes, that does help. But your real big ticket items are, for one, like quality sleep is your biggest recovery tool. Most people get suboptimal in prep. And once you're low body fat, it's usually just, even if you raise food up, it can still be suboptimal, right?
Yep.
And then there's the total like allosteric stress load of a prep. There's more cardio in place. There's lower food in place. So all of that together is just diminishing your recovery capacity too. And there's still like some hormones that you might not be fully optimized in, even though you are maybe replacing some in.
Yep.
Now, what else do we have? We have leading into this peak week of the first show, potentially, you're accruing the most fatigue possible with being the lowest body fat, digging down hard for the last bit of fat loss, but also you have to even think about the connective tissue wear and tear of the training that is occurring. So am I leaving something out, Luke, around the suboptimal conditions of recovery leading into post-show?
No, I think it starts to point to kind of how important like mapping out the contest prep is on the forefront, and why we harp so much on mapping out timelines well, ensuring your rates of loss kind of match the timeline that you're setting out for the show, because this is how you avoid a lot of these things that could really take away from your ability to recover or keep this like chronic stress input extremely high, right? Like, and to me, that's where the conversation begins of like how to manage that situation. But when we look at like the situation between shows, if you're in that suboptimal environment where you're pushing the deficit pretty much all the way up till showtime or very close proximity, or it's taking a lot to get someone down into shape, that debt has to be paid. And that debt is not going to be paid if you then are trying to push the envelope into like bringing volume up and growing kind of immediately post show. It's actually probably going to put you in a worse situation and potentially make you look worse for that next showing. And so this is kind of where I brought up in that initial like spiel of like the situation coming out of that original prep is really huge, or that first peak, because in those situations where you're pushing it in really close proximity to the show, like, man, the thought of trying to improve a physique with a time frame between shows that you would typically have is just, I don't think logical in any way, shape, or form.
I think for a lot of people, it's like right when you're there, it's like, well, number one is just dropping off all the fatigue that's present with raising food up, deloading your training, so actually having some reduction, and just getting fresh enough again to maybe maintain that condition into the next show.
Yep.
Or you might have a situation where someone does need some more fat loss. And if they were that dug down, you might need that little bit of recovery then to bring them back down. And so that's kind of like the realism, and you have to look at the timeline too. So how fast does muscle tissue grow, and how much does it really take to add stage weight on? Like in a month, like what maybe a pound of muscle? Gosh, if you were even lucky, like imagine if 12 months of off season, you had 12 pounds of muscle every year. Like we don't see that happen. So even a pound of stage weight in 4 weeks of being optimal is very tough. So now we have to account for all these things post show of like dropping off fatigue and getting you back to a position where you're recovered enough, but still with body fat low, you are going to be somewhat suboptimal. And then maybe 4 weeks is a realism to add a little bit of tissue on if you've managed everything extremely well. So then you might have to consider pulling someone back down, right? So really like the timeline to improve, if you're looking at nearly less than 5 weeks to your next show, it's really not that realistic to see drastic changes occur. And you'd probably go back to the point of like, if that's your main critique, to add more size and you're going to do another show in 5 weeks, that's probably not best allocation of your time based on your needs.
Why compete, right?
Right. Why compete? However, there's some different timelines out there, or even where this competitions are sparse, right? In some countries, to where maybe you do have an 8 or a 12-week spacing between a show. That might be time to do something. This is completely ruling out, I'd even say, the natural crowd, because you're basically just going to be maintained, like bring some body weight up and then bring it back down, but you're not, minimal muscle gain is even possible. But in the enhanced side, it could be. And it's starting out the gate, that's possible, more so to a degree if someone has been very well managed in their prep. So if you're coming into a peak week with not a lot of those issues that I mentioned earlier, right? So you've already been able to be conditioned and start raising up food. That's a huge component around it. So you have like one variable that's kind of in your favor too. That already might start improving sleep quality as well.
Yep.
Then if you also have someone that's very experienced in managing all their life stress and being extremely routine, that is already setting them up in a better environmental position to allow those adaptations to occur too. So for that new person out there, that's their routines all over the place. They're trying to travel these last weeks into prep. It's very hard to have enough recovery gained through that, because I think stress management is so underrated for being able to raise your ceiling for how much training stimulus you can handle. But that's a big one that I see. Yeah.
And how you push and manage the the adaptations of fat loss, right? Like how well that goes is so largely stress dependent. And I think that these are the cups that you're starting to look at of like, how full are they? And I would like to comment, like, and you tell me if you agree or disagree, but even in those really perfectly well-managed preps, anything sub 5 weeks, like making any significant improvements, to me, I just don't think is on the table or on the cards. I think you're probably looking at processes where the next show is 8, 9, 10 weeks away, where you could potentially see a pretty significant difference in visuals. I think you could arguably like make some PED changes and get some fullness back in that 5 weeks if you're already in contest shape, and potentially have a couple pounds extra on stage that visually looks the same just from a fullness perspective. But I don't think that actual tissue accrual is going to happen significantly in that short of a time frame. And so like we're starting to get into the realms of, and I do want to map out what this looks like, because I do think it's a worthy conversation to have, because I'm actually running a prep now where, and I'm sure she wouldn't mind sharing, is she got ready way ahead, right? And she's kind of running this 8 to 10 weeks because she's in one of those countries that only has a couple shows a year. And so she's already in shape. We're kind of coming back up, and she's kind of growing into the show. And it's kind of like we ran a modified peak week. We got in shape, kind of tested some things, and now we're in this like recovery phase, and everything's flying and she's improving. So it's an interesting dynamic to talk about, because I think it is absolutely possible. But it takes the stars aligning for sure.
Do you want to bring up the PED exposure around that to put context?
Yeah. So in which case?
This is the first exposure, right?
Yeah. It's no, it's not first exposure. It's like third, but the second one was cut extremely short, so we could call it second. So it's second exposure to PEDs. It's like really novel, just within this year. And so like we're gaining adaptations that are part of that process is going to be that novel exposure to PEDs, right? And so like this early competitor of like first 2 to 3 years of competing, like that response that comes from that, it's pretty massive. And with it being female, like it being few and far between as well, with, risk management, like just even further case where stars align pretty well.
I think that's the case too. Like, hey, she started working with Luke, and you're like quickly optimizing all the other variables. Like your training's improved, your routine's improved, like nutrition's improved. And then we sprinkle in a little bit of PEDs on top. And then it's like, boom, like it all syncs together. So if you're the person that has it all locked in, all these other variables, and you might only have the PED card to play to actually grow still in a show, between a show, it might take quite a bit of that PED input beyond what you could even used in the past to make that occur to a significant degree. And that's when you bring in the question, is it worth it to do it? And what does the rest of your competitive career look like? I think is that going to the Olympia? Is that what we're looking at here, and why it's justified, or is it not? I think another point to this to make, Luke, is that person coming into that show is how far away from their probably like body fat set point are they?
Yeah.
Because if it's pretty close to maintainable, I'll use myself example. Like the better I've gotten over the years of managing body fat, my variables in the off season, I can just stay super lean in the off season, but it's not suboptimal. So below my set point, like it's not that low. So I'm nearly like could be almost off-season body fat levels, to where this isn't like I'm sucked down in prep and trying to grow. It's just not that far off from it anymore. So if you have someone that really has to dig down the last bit to get the fat off, even if they maintain now and washed off fatigue, they're still so far pulled from this settling point that's going to be the harder person to really create some more positive adaptations from. that same person, and just on a similar matter, might need to consider what was the PED load needed to get to that first show, and what was the health toll to it. Because when we're looking at what needs to happen post-show, it's not just from, does the person need more size? Do they need condition? But it's also, how do we recover the health side to be able to repeat this process again for the next show? Because if you watch bodybuilding, there's some guys that just start getting worse, and absolutely because around organ stress, which will limit growth, it'll limit fat loss to where guys don't come in as sharp as what they were. So part of this is like, having to remove that PED stress, and that might be removing a lot of the compounds out that need to be there to be able to put them back in. So it's that situation. It's not like, oh, I'll just keep taking more gear into my next show. It's like, well, you have to manage health so you can even peak properly again. Thanks everyone for tuning in to today's podcast. Are you struggling to hit your peak on show day? Feeling lost in the off season? Upgrade your coaching game with J3 University. Our program covers everything from off season to contest prep to peak week, all based from real client results. Along with our comprehensive physique curriculum, you'll also get access to our 4 rooms with our J3U team to answer any questions you have, and live Q&A sessions to further your coaching and athlete experience. We are the source of education for top IFBB pros and coaches. Join us to elevate the coaching standard at J3 University. Let's get back to today's podcast.
So from the health management side of the equation, like, I'm working in the best environment I possibly could right now with like long duration of previous exposure, just implementing in a place that, and honestly, like, I think part of this happened because the rate of loss I mapped out, she ended up having about 6 pounds, 7 pounds more muscle than I expected her to have on stage. So it's like she got to that like wellness level of conditioning about 6 pounds heavier than I expected her to. So it's like, not only we did more work in the all season than I thought, but now I've gotten here into wellness shape without PEDs being in play, and I have them saved for this back portion of the prep. It's like, man, it's not how I would plan to run a prep for most people, but it's exactly what this in-between post-show phase would need almost in order to be able to grow into a show.
I want to put some context around this dosing, just because I wanted to paint a picture on some guys out there that are thinking like, oh yeah, I'm going to grow and just with X amount of PEDs.
Hell
like
yeah.
This female example, like what was her total milligram amount?
50 milligrams every other day. So 60 on the top end if you.
Yeah. Okay. So 60, maybe a female maybe has the actual 10 milligram of testosterone per week, if maybe 7. So think about that exposure level. That would be like a guy going from about 100 milligram of testosterone per week, right? TRT.
Yep.
To then moving up to 600 milligrams of test per week. Basically a first time exposure cycle of 600 milligrams out the gate. You would explode, right? That's what that's equivalent to. So if you're prepping and on your prep, you're like, yeah, man, I'm running 2000 milligrams a week. Don't think you're going to now run 2200 milligrams in your post show and be like exploding with growth.
I know.
It's not going to happen when you're in a suboptimal position. Think about the percent difference of what this female had, or what an earlier exposure male would have, right? Moving up that amount, the percentage increase that's required. That's why to really grow to a significant degree, like, man, you would incur quite a bit of organ stress. Yep. I'm definitely not saying up your dose 6 times and take like 10 grams post show, but I just want context there of that. It takes a lot to move the needle percentage wise in that type of environment.
Yeah.
So I would, look at like what your off-season dosaging was and what you were for prep, and then have to make decisions based around that. Like I'm in a position like currently where this is what I'm doing. Like I'm done multiple shows. It was 12 weeks between the Vancouver win to the Olympia. I'm very fresh and low fatigue. And another important point is that I didn't eat like a jerk after the show and have to diet back for 2 weeks. Another point to be brought up is, if you really want to do this well,
Massive.
Don't go eat a bunch of shit post show. Just go straight back to your plan. Because I see people that eat for even 2 days, It's like every day is a week of having to diet it back off. I shit you not. So you're going to lose time is what I'm saying. But anyway, 12 weeks to Olympia. I had a short prep, lower PED exposure, and health markers are great. I'm low fatigue state. It makes a lot of sense from a risk perspective to keep PEDs up closer to what I've had in the off season. I didn't go as high as what I've done in the off season, but it was probably it was a bigger amount than what I'm doing was in prep to diet down, because I know it takes a lot to drive that process upward. But the rationale here is like, there's a lot of things lining up to make sense to do from a career level athlete, right?
Yep.
If this is going to your, you're doing nationals and you have that long gap between North Americans and
NPC
and
nationals.
actual NPC nationals, that might not be the best route to do it, when also likely you have a lot of tissue to accrue. And that's when you have the off season is really the time to address the size aspect. I think this really starts applying more so for your pro level and Olympia level athletes is really where I would reserve it for.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people are taking this of what they see these pros doing and trying to apply it to everyone else. And you see these guys growing between shows. Like we've seen Sampson do it, Andrew Jack, like they compete frequently, they're growing, but also some of these guys are newer to even competing and even PD exposure, but all variables are optimized. Like these guys this is their career. So that's part of it. But also the risk is justified in their career, which it's not when you're earlier on. And also you need a lot of tissue to add on. If you already have quite a bit of muscle, you can compete more frequently, and likely your preps aren't going to be as long because you're not having to push body fat as high in the off season for these long off seasons that might occur. So I think there's just a lot of context to think about of like, who are we looking at here and how are they doing it? Why are they doing it? And does that even cross over and apply to me?
Yeah. And I'm glad you brought this up, because like the caveat that I want to give here is this is a very specific situation we're discussing and not what we would call and why we kind of differentiated in the beginning, ideal way to maximize the amount of tissue accrual time frame between shows, right? So like if you are that amateur level competitor who was 4th at North Americans and you need to improve before you win your pro card at NPC Nationals, it's like the best way to do that, to close that gap and potentially be ready for a pro stage the next time you compete at a national level, because there's nothing wrong with being that good, go into an all-season phase. Like if you're truly thinking about competing at the highest level, you should be concerned about closing the gap between where you are in the pro stage, not just closing the gap between where you are in the national level, and taking that time to do it in the kind of the way we map it out in the post-show module and mapping it out that way, rather than this special situation we're talking about, is going to be the best way to do it. But we've kind of taught a lot of PEDs. I think a little bit of a touch on nutrition training and potentially even using yourself as a case study to kind of explain some of this would be good, as far as how does that look on this time between shows if you have this opportunity to do this in that higher level athlete?
Yeah. The first thing is, of course, managing your timeline, because you have to reverse engineer and make sure you have time to diet back down, because some body fat is going to happen depending on what compounds you're putting back in place. It might be skewed a bit with the visuals with water retention. So if you're bringing up a lot of growth hormone or testosterone or nandrolone, whatever it may be, you just have to be considerate of that. So for like what I do is post show, of course I had a meal to celebrate, but that week is getting back to my baseline pre-peak week weight. That was for me also not depleted because I was ready. So I want to get back to that. That's when I start moving food up into a slight surplus from there. And basically I have a rough estimate of like, hey, I am looking at how much, what was my rate of fat loss leading into my first show. Like I know I could pull 2 to 3 pounds off a week. And so I can look back over, all right, from peak week out, I want to be ready 2 weeks ahead of the Olympia, right? So that's, from my 3 week out mark, okay, that's 2 to 3 pounds. 4-week out, 2 to 3 pounds, and I can keep scooting it back to know like, all right, if I'm 6 weeks out, I can't be heavier than this amount of weight. And it's also being considerate too, which makes it really complicated with PDs, is that once you're lean and you bring PDs back, you could probably handle some things and get a lot of fullness out of it. And that might allow you to come back to that next show a bit heavier. And we see that happen with some guys too, right? Like there's not a long time between shows, but there's still like 5-6 pounds up to the next show. And some of that's like they had to really deplete down for that first show. Once they got lean, then they could really push food up and they just get a lot of fullness just from food alone. So you might account for that second show. You might allow some body weight to be higher, but basically it's reverse engineering to where the amount of fat you have in that phase, knowing how many weeks it takes you to pull back down. So I'm actually on this cusp as we're doing this. We'll be 6 weeks-ish out whenever this comes out. I'm 239 in Vancouver, before like show day and stuff, I was 227, 228. So I'm like 11 pounds above what that stage weight was. However, there's some variables that changed for me that, I brought back up growth hormone and testosterone a lot, which was very beneficial in fullness. So I think that's an accounting for some weight that's going to be pushed up. And there's definitely been significant progress made in my visuals, and strength is correlating well with the body weight increasing. So there should be more stage weight that's present. I do think I could be over that 230 mark coming into the show. Even 231, 232 is a potential. So I know I pulled 2 to 3 pounds off a week. Being ready ahead, I'm probably close to that, to where, hey, you probably want to start dieting down in the next week. And so that's the rough gauge of how you would look at that. I know it gets really murky though with PEDs, doesn't it?
It does. As a caveat, having seen these visuals, I think it'll definitely be higher than 230 this go around.
It very well could be. It very well could be. And everyone says like you take too much time to diet. It's just like, man,
So
you would always ready ahead versus just you happen to be ready too late. And anyway, nutrition wise though, it's just, you very well might see a great situation where you add food in and someone could even get leaner. And I was talking to Chris Tuttle about this, and one of his classic guys, you add in like, a 5% increase of calories to start, and then they just start dropping weight. You're like, wow, you have to keep feeding them up because they start getting so much more productive in output. But eventually you get to a spot where, hey, like, a half pound to a pound per week is like pretty good rate of progress. Yep. And that's kind of what I look for in this phase with PDs in place. Any slower, and you're probably leaving a lot on the table, or you might have weeks where if output gets a little higher, you're actually just not making progress at all. But you very well could add tissue on and not see much body fat change at all in this phase. For me, I had one food increase, and that was it. 40-gram carb addition. And that kept me moving this whole entire time. But I'm someone that's not very adaptive. And so you might have the more liberal adapter to a diet where you have to keep putting food in to keep them moving at that rate. So it just really depends. But this is the time to be really strict. It's not off season. Nope. So there's not time to go off and eat pizzas every weekend and things like that. Like you're going to blow it if you're doing stuff like that. This is like me on my diet nonstop, and just a continuation of prep, because that is what it is. As far as like training goes, if you're coming from a state of low fatigue, you very well, once that is wiped off, you could move up to more specialized split if you needed it, with some slight volume additions. That's what I personally have done. So I was doing like six sets of quads on prep. I actually moved them all the way up to 10 sets leading into Olympia. And even with chest, I've added in about 3 sets as well. So that volume is scaled up and moved from 5 days a week to training 6 days a week. But by doing so, those sessions shortened. So it's a much more managed fatigue-wise session. Yep. And so it's possible, like you need to put more stimulus in to grow. Sometimes just raising food alone is enough to make training performance so much better that the stimulus is there. But if you can also raise that recovery ceiling too, and you could afford a little bit more volume, you absolutely could see more progress. But if those things aren't lined up, all the gear doesn't matter. Like that's the most important thing is like the nutrition, the training, managing your recovery and not getting fat. If you do those things, like then the PEDs can really shine. But with they're not in place, like you'll just blow your timeline. Or run into injuries really quickly in this between show period.
Yeah, and look, shameless plug here. I actually built out like a lot of this opportunity to potentially specialize training and what the math looks like for this in level 2. Like there's a case study in there which really kind of lays it all out for like a longer duration that's really cool to see so that you can kind of see all this on paper. And it's pretty cool. It's one of our J3U coaches, Braden Kardash, between shows during our first show season together. So it's a really cool kind of case study of seeing all this in application of like how training could potentially be specialized. What was cool with him is we actually saw a pretty impressive visual difference in a back double from the first show to the next show, like 12 weeks later. So yeah, that's all in there. And it's a really cool case to get to work with. Like when you get this opportunity to do it, things happen right before your eyes and it's pretty crazy.
It's almost a value in someone prepping to get the most of an off season because you really do learn a lot in executing variables in prep. And if you can truly carry those out, like if they've never experienced that into a post show or into an off season, man, that's when you can see some progress. And even with not increasing PDs at all, I've had people just going back to a baseline amount and still even improving because their variables are so much better. So And just the last thing I wanted to leave with is that, some people say, well, you can make your most gains in the post-show phase with leaving some PEDs up. However, once you have to look past that because for one, a lot of the accrual that you see in the post-show period when you're trying to run it into your off season is there's a lot of fluid accumulation that skews variables. Makes you give the perception that you're making a lot of progress, but it's also just a lot of water retention. So when you get to the end of this 8-week phase that you're running, you're left with having to lower PDs because you haven't addressed health markers. You're left also with a lot of water dropping off, and you're going to look like a deflated, softer version of yourself, now having to do a low PD period, then restart. What I like to do is just a complete linear potentiation in the off season, which sounds super cool. And that's why I said it that way is we start with the minimal threshold PDs to drive the needle up because food and training is going to be extremely responsive. Then right at that 8-week phase, when you're like, when normally you have to drop gear down, you don't because you've managed your health in this phase. We got the most from the least. Now we start off season and we just literally keep increasing along the way. Not maybe completely linearly, but there'll be some waves in there. But overall, you won't be trying to take all the progress in 8 weeks and being left also with the psychological mess of seeing training drop off, you get softer. So it's by far, like I've done it both ways. And this is by far my favorite way to grow throughout post show and then into off season. So
yeah,
we'll cut it off there.
Yeah, cut it.
And thank you all for tuning in. And we'll talk to you next time.